Oh no, another assault against Christianity. Be very afraid.
Whoa! It's Todd Friel, boing! And I with my levitational power. So if you're here today and you thought, I can't be forgiven, I'm too bad of a sinner, you don't know how good of a Savior Jesus is.
No matter who you are, no matter what you have done, where sin did abound, grace abounds that much more. Hello, and welcome to a Flashback Friday on Wretched. My name is Todd Friel. I'm your host, the Wretch the song refers to. Have you noticed, despite all of the external and internal assaults against the Church of Jesus Christ, there has never been dealt a death blow? Why is that? Why does the Christian church continue to stand and even grow? And it is, despite what some statisticians tell you, why is it that even though people continue to fire fiery darts at the church, it continues to flourish? Why? Because Jesus promised. Matthew 16, he promised, I'm going to build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail over it. That means politicians will not prevail over it. That means progressive postmodernism will not prevail against the church. That also means that internal threats will not avail. It will not put an end to the true church of Jesus Christ. Consider all of the bad things that have happened inside of the visible church that I think with most institutions would cause it to crumble. Think about throughout the church history, the early ages, the amount of scandals, the amount of heretics that challenged Orthodox theology progressed through the ages. Crusades in the name of Jesus, inquisitions, the debauchery inside of the visible church, and yet it continues to stand. What about the external threats? They're nonstop. They just don't seem to end, do they? Atheists, in an effort to suppress the truth of God that they know inside of their noggins, yep, he exists, they will use virtually anything to take some sort of a poke at the church in an effort to do what Jesus said can't be done. In this particular flashback, they come, they go. Have you noticed none of these external assaults on the church have had any real legs? They pop up, they hit the headlines, the secular media loves to talk about these, and then they just kind of slink away into the Da Vinci Code night, and they have not overcome the church. On this here particular flashback, prepare to see another one of those external threats. Now, this was done, I don't know how many years, just like 5 years ago. Have you heard about this since then? Whenever there is a story, regardless of how credible the source of information, regardless of how lame the argument is, if it is a screed against Christianity, the Bible, or Jesus Christ, it's going to make the rounds. Perhaps recently you've seen this story and thought, oh no, what did they discover archaeologically that disproves that Jesus actually existed? Here is the story that we look at stories every day here at Wretched. We are scouring news sites perpetually. I'm not sure there isn't a media outlet that didn't pick up this story. Why? Supposedly it proves Jesus is merely fiction.
Caesar's Messiah was a book published by a dot-com businessman named Joseph Atwill in 2005. Last year, he released a documentary based on the book, and everyone is talking about it all of a sudden because Atwill put out the world's most misleading press release for his film screening in London. Richard Dawkins then retweeted the press release, even though he said he didn't endorse the theory, and now this 8-year-old theory is news again. Thank you, Richard Dawkins. The basic premise of Caesar's Messiah is that the Roman imperial family, the Flavians, invented Jesus by using the Jewish historian Josephus and presumably other people to write the Gospels after Rome defeated the Jews in 70 AD. The idea was to make the militant Jewish rebels accept a peaceful Messiah and thereby give Rome less trouble. Atwill says that the New Testament was written in a code that requires you to read Josephus's War of the Jews alongside the New Testament to get the joke. He, of course, is the only person to crack this code, making him super smart.
Perhaps too smart for his own good. Did you catch the premise? You see, the Bible was just made up by the Romans. They took this book, built in a little code and a little bibbity-bobbity-boo, and we're supposed to get the joke 2,000 years later that Jesus was actually invented. This is so much nonsense. How much nonsense is it? This is so much nonsense that Bart Ehrman thinks this guy is a little bit dingy. Now, just in case you don't know who Bart is, he is a supposed New Testament scholar. He made a Christian profession of faith. He went to Wheaton College, got his master's in theology, and now he's backslidden because he never slid forward in the first place, and he's warring against Jesus. He writes books to prove that the New Testament has been tinkered with, that that's not really what Jesus said. But as far as debating whether or not Jesus actually existed, Bart Ehrman, let's just give him the benefit of the doubt and call him an agnostic. Even he believes that this recent, well, not so recent really, theory, it was just written with a really good press release, is downright dingy. Just the same, you are going to have to deal with it if you're witnessing to people. Hey, I thought they found some sort of creed that said that the Romans actually made up this idea of Jesus, and we better be ready to counter this nonsense. Now, we are going to offer you, Christians should love this, because this is going to be like the old country buffet. We're just going to lay a big old banquet of options for you. You grab the one that you want so that when somebody brings this up to you or your child says, hey, Mom, Dad, what about this theory that Jesus didn't exist? You can do a big smackdown with just one of these refutations.
One of the biggest problems this theory has is the existence of Christianity before 73 AD, when Atwill says that the idea was concocted by the Romans. Quite simply, if Christianity can be demonstrated to exist before that time, this theory is toast. The famous historian Tacitus says that Nero was persecuting Christians in Rome in 64 AD. He also mentions that immense multitudes of Christians were living in Rome at the time. Try to figure out why immense multitudes of Christians are in Rome 10 years before Christianity was supposed to have been invented. Suetonius also mentions Nero punishing Christians, as well as many Christian historians. This seems like a bad PR idea, to write this kind of stuff. Hey everyone, join the new religion so we can burn you alive and feed you to lions. The sign-up sheet is right over there. Paul, who tradition has being killed by Nero around 66 AD, wrote 13 of the letters in the New Testament, all of them very Christian. Even the most skeptical scholars in this field don't date these letters later than 68 AD, and most of them much earlier than that.
Needless to say, Atwill's history is very lame. He claims that the Roman emperors from the Flavian dynasty, they created this Jesus idea in 73, and yet we have external manuscripts, not biblical manuscripts, that state there were lots of Christians already in Rome. Oops. Now there's one piece of evidence you can use to counter this cockamamie theory. Here is option number 2.
Why in the world would the Romans do this? They had already totally crushed the Jews in 70 AD, destroying the city and the temple. When the Romans had a problem with people not wanting to conform to their rules, which they did often, they did what they do best: crush people into submission with war. There was never any reason to do anything different, especially at this point in their history. Also, consider that the Jews weren't even a threat to them in any meaningful way. Plus, as I said, they had already completely destroyed them. Atwill, in response to J.P. Holding on the point that the Romans had already defeated the Jews, said, well, yeah, but Josephus mentions that the Romans had some problems with a few Jewish rebels from Alexandria just after the war. Holding replied, saying, what Josephus refers to is disturbances in Alexandria that were instigated by the Sicarii, who had fled to Jerusalem after being beaten there. So in reality, this was nothing more than a mop-up after a decisive victory. And, I might add, no reason for Titus to invent a religion for them, since he beat them soundly there as well.
Annoying Yes, but at the same time, encouraging. These external assaults on the church, they're kind of like mosquitoes in Minnesota. They're just, they don't kill you, they don't take you out, but they sure can be annoying, and it doesn't take much to squash them, does it? Do you remember the bone box of Jesus? We had the ossuary, the burial box of Jesus. So they said, see, he's not a resurrected Savior. Have you seen that argument lately? No. Debunked, lickety-split. That thing was put onto a shelf someplace and is used no more to undermine the faith. And yet the assaults keep coming. And so the debunking must continue to happen. And it will next on a Flashback Friday on Wretched. What is the cost of each one of these images? $28. A $28 ultrasound 80% of the time saves the life of a child. Would encourage you to support preborn.org, $28 per ultrasound. Please support as many as you can so that we can see more beautiful images like this.
When Paul evangelized the Corinthians, he did so with fear and much trembling. That's because Paul failed to order copies of Don't Stub Your Toe at Wretched.org. Evangelizing doesn't have to be scary. Once a week or once a month, simply leave a copy of Don't Stub Your Toe for someone to find. So take the Big Toe Challenge and order 12 or 52 copies of Don't Stub Your Toe today at Wretched.org.
Perhaps you're wondering, what's the point of debunking an assault on the church that has already been debunked? Good question. Welcome back to a Flashback Friday on Wretched. Going back just a number of years ago, Joseph Atwill trying to demonstrate that Christianity is a farce. It's a made-up fantasy. On this particular flashback, totally debunked. So why take a look at this years later? It's actually an encouragement. This really should encourage us. The world who hates Jesus is just going to continue bing, bing, bing to shoot. And of course, the church is like Teflon. It's just going to continue to ricochet off. Why? Because Jesus Christ is building his church so that the next time you see the latest assault against the faith, you're going to go, oh yeah, another one, debunked. Joseph Atwill has concocted this cockamamie story with not nearly as much alliteration. You see, the Jews, these were problematic people for the Romans, and they couldn't figure out any way to get them under control. Forget the fact that in 70 AD, they pretty much just wiped up all of Jerusalem. But they couldn't get those Jews under control because, well, they're pretty rebellious sort of people. So they thought to themselves, here's what we'll do. We'll create this guy, this fictional character named Jesus Christ, and he'll be a gentle fisherman from Galilee, a peaceful one who would say, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. Therefore, they'll get in line, they'll start believing in this Jesus character, even though he didn't even exist at all, and they'll start behaving more peacefully. They'll be more ironic, and they won't rebel, and we won't have such a difficult time with those Jews. No, I'm not kidding. And it is just as ridiculous as the Barack Obama, Bill Cosby show theory. We have been seeing some debunking of this pure nonsense. And unfortunately, a lot of kids at government schools are going to hear about this, and it's going to be thrown in their faces. My encouragement, make sure that you have a way to debunk this theory. Make sure you grab one of these debunkings so that you can be equipped to respond to it. I know, this is absolutely ridiculous, and maybe you're not even believing me at this point. Well, perhaps this will persuade you I'm not making up this nonsense. Joseph Atwill did.
Atwill says that when in Matthew 4 it says, quote, "Then he said to them, 'Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men,' they immediately left their nets and followed him." The parallel to this is supposed to be when Josephus recorded Titus, after a naval defeat of the Jews, killed the ones remaining in the water by spears and cutting off their hands. If you don't see the parallel, it's probably because you aren't smart enough like Atwill is. After all, he is the only one who knows the secret code of the New Testament.
No, I'm not making this up. Perhaps you're a doubting Thomas-like. That was one example. Here would be example, if you can call it that, number 2.
Josephus reports that a woman named Mary ate her child during the siege of Jerusalem when there was no food left. Atwill says that this gruesome act of starvation was supposed to represent Jesus, saying that the bread at the Last Supper represented his body, which would be broken for them. These kind of claims, of course, are unfalsifiable. Whenever you choose to change meanings to your liking, you can make anything be a match. And so this section of his book is pretty much worthless.
Remember the concept, here's the premise. The Romans wrote the New Testament with kind of secret code, bibbidi-bobbidi-boo, kind of Dan Brown sort of fiction. They wrote this, made it up so that the Jews would believe it. Now, let's take a look and see what the Romans supposedly wrote in the New Testament to determine, does that even make any sense at all?
So the Romans created a guy who said stuff like, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me," Matthew 28:18. Jesus tells his followers over and over that loyalty to him supersedes all other loyalties, including political authorities. An example of his followers disobeying the government because Jesus' teaching supersedes it can be found in Acts 5:29 and 4:19. It's difficult to express how atrocious and downright scary that idea would be to the Romans. So you're telling us that you have a true king who you are more loyal to than the emperor? Yeah, that idea was not a Roman invention, I can assure you.
Right. You had to bow to the Roman emperor and call him king. So they wrote a book that said, no, Jews, to get you under control, we don't want you to call the emperor king, we want you to call Jesus king. Yeah, sure.
Rome really didn't care what your religion was, as long as you would also worship their gods. So why in the world would you create a Messiah who forbids the worshiping of other gods, especially emperors, if your goal is to make them good Roman citizens? So many Christians were dying in the early days of Christianity because they refused this practice of sacrificing to the Roman gods. Pliny the Younger wrote the Emperor Trajan asking him what he should do because he was having to kill so many people, including women and children. He wanted to confirm with the emperor that the official policy was to kill them if they didn't sacrifice to Caesar. He had not dealt with this before because there weren't many religions out there that had a problem with sacrificing to Caesar. We actually have a copy of Trajan's response to Pliny the Younger. So if you want to know how Rome felt about this, here you go. Quote, "If they are denounced and proved guilty, they are to be punished, with this reservation, that whoever denies that he is a Christian and really proves it, that is, by worshiping our gods, even though he was under suspicion in the past, shall obtain pardon." Think about that logically. Trajan is saying that the proof that a person is really a Christian in his eyes is that they won't worship the emperor. Does that really sound like something that Rome would create for the people? If there was anything that Rome was more scared of than angering the gods, it was slave revolts. 75% of the Roman Empire consisted of slaves, and so if they ever got the idea to rally around a cause, they could easily destroy Rome. So why create a religion where the hero is a falsely accused criminal who was crucified by the Roman government? This mass of slaves being loyal to the Christian God over and above the emperor, as well as being anti-Roman gods, was a very bad thing for Rome.
Doesn't matter these days. You write a dopey book, you create a sensational press release, wah and la, you are in the news, supposedly with the proof that Jesus didn't exist. Kind of amazing when you think about it that one man cannot concoct a conspiracy that is consistent, that undermines the Christian church. Think about the Bible. How many authors? Dozens. Over centuries. And yet that story continues to hold together. Why? Because one is inspired by God. The other is a fictitious fantasy of men who hate God, and so we study the true to debunk the false, which we'll continue to do next on Wretched.
In the Bible, Jesus is called the cornerstone. When laying a foundation, every stone must be aligned in reference to the cornerstone. God is building his church as a holy temple, and as believers, we are being brought into line with the cornerstone, Jesus Christ.
It's that time of year again when we come to you to encourage you to consider supporting us financially with your ongoing tax-deductible gifts. And maybe you're saying, what time of year is that exactly that you're talking about there? Well, the reality is it's every day, all year, that we truly do need your support. If this happens to be a good season for you to consider supporting this year Wretched ministry, please know it is much needed and it is greatly appreciated, whatever it happens to be. To learn more, you can simply visit our website, wretched.org/donate, wretched.org/donate. Welcome back to a Flashback Friday on Wretched. You say, what's the program about? I say, let's let the rather exercised, skinny young fellow tell us. One of the hot stories these days to discredit Christianity, Joseph Atwill saying the Romans, in order to get the Jews in line, created a character named Jesus so that they'd read about this peaceful fisherman and stop warring against Rome and causing them all kinds of problems. So they basically created the entire New Testament. That's the premise. He's being treated as a credible scholar. Seriously. He's being brought onto talk shows to perpetuate this nonsense. And all you and I need to do is look inside of our own book to say, does that theory make any sense at all?
It also gave these slaves a new sense of honor. For example, after this point, slaves started refusing to have sex with their masters on account of them being Christians and their Christian God forbidding it. Here's a question. If this religion was created to make radical, militant Jews good Roman citizens, why in the world does Jesus and the New Testament clearly intend to reach the Gentiles, people who already were good Roman citizens? Matthew 24:14 says, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come." Also Matthew 28:19, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." Why in the world would you make this Christian God that you invent tell his utterly devoted followers to go convert Romans? If a Roman converted, it would turn a good emperor-worshipping citizen into a non-emperor-worshipping enemy of the state. What a stupid plan, Titus! He also made a huge mistake by writing the New Testament Gospels in Greek, which would make a ton of sense if the early Christians were trying to reach the Gentile world, but it makes little to no sense if the reverse is true, that is, that the Romans were trying to reach Aramaic-speaking Jews.
Oh, and one other tiny little wrinkle-dinkle.
Another logical impossibility is that all these Jews just accepted these hot-off-the-presses Gospels, which were claiming to be historical, as true, even though they all just lived through the time period that these Gospels were describing, but obviously no one ever saw any of the events recorded in them because they were all made up. So, this guy was going around raising the dead, healing leprosy, healing the sick. He became a rock star all throughout Israel, where crowds routinely got up to 5,000. He had all these royal rumbles with rulers in public places, turning over tables in the temple, etc. He was even crucified on the Passover when an eclipse and an earthquake happened, and no one ever said, "Hey, I don't remember seeing any of that. I don't know anyone that ever did. My parents never spoke of it. What the heck? I'll die for that."
Imagine if we tried to perpetuate a character named Bill. Bill, just the other day, didn't you see it? He actually healed the entire planet, didn't you? Oh, you need to believe in Bill. Of course, you'd go, well, that's stupid. Nobody's ever even seen this. What are you talking about? We're alive when you're making these preposterous claims about Bill. That's exactly the case with Jesus. They could not create this fictional character without him being completely debunked. Why? Because lack of eyewitnesses were still alive. Bunked. Let that encourage you, Christian. The assaults, they are going to come, and the assaults, they are going to go, and the Church of Jesus Christ is going to continue to stand. That means internal threats cannot overcome the church. That means Rob Bell cannot overcome the church. The New Apostolic Reformation movement cannot overcome the church. Any sort of heresy will never overcome the church. Even as you take a look around and you think it is getting bleaker and bleaker, you have God's word. Nothing is going to overcome the church. That means Democrats will not overcome the church. Oprah Winfrey cannot overcome the church. Whatever postmodernism has to bring as an assault against truth, it will not overcome the church. You have Jesus' word on it. Surprise, next on Wretched.
We want to say a very big thank you for helping kids learn to follow Jesus.
Thank you very much.
Those are just some of the thousands of wonderful volunteers who run Tomorrow Clubs, kids clubs scattered throughout Eastern Europe. $30, 30 young disciples a month. Would you please consider supporting your own Tomorrow Clubs? tomorrowclubs.org/wretched.
Every disagreement among believers does not need to end in a fight or a church split. So, how can we love one another even when we disagree? The answer, Christian liberty. The biblical doctrine of Christian liberty will help you, your family, and your church navigate through tough issues without butting heads. For a limited time, get your free download of Christian Liberty at wretched.org/liberty. Wretched. Amazing grace.
Welcome back to a Wretched surprise. Always love the Grace Gems. Here we go. This from Charles Spurgeon, a pithy one. Grace and sin are quarrelsome neighbors. On the one hand, you got sin abounding, but on the other hand, you've got grace superabounding, and yet we still see ourselves at war with sin. So why do we continue to wrestle against sin when grace is hyperabounding? This carcass, this flesh, it's not redeemed. I've got one new nature, but I've got this body that hasn't been glorified, and so I've got quarrelsome neighbors. How do you sin less and less? It is by appreciating grace more and more. Let's see who won something, shall we? Congratulations to Janice, I hope I say this right, Sickinger? Say Janice's last name.
Sickinger.
Exactly what I said. Winning a copy of Untethered. I'm sorry, Janice, if we biffed that on you. Untethered, it belongs to Miss Janice. It could belong to you. Simply subscribe to our free Wretched newsletter at wretched.org. And until tomorrow, sorry again, Janice, go serve your king.
Thank you for spending time with Wretched, and thank you for your tax-deductible financial support that allows us to preach the amazing gospel. Wretched, amazing grace.